The wealthy widow and the orphan girl. The village of Kumasi was known for its wealth and beauty. The houses stood tall, their roofs gleaming under the sun, and the streets were lined with golden palm trees that swayed gently in the wind. But among the wealthiest in Kumasi was Madam Efua, a woman whose name was whispered with both respect and fear. She was a widow, and though her husband had left her with more riches than she could ever spend, she was known to be as cold as the night wind. Efua's house, an enormous mansion with high walls and iron gates, was a place few dared to enter. But the real terror of her estate was not Efua herself, it was her black hound, Kofi. Kofi was no ordinary dog. He was massive, with muscles rippling under his dark fur, and his eyes gleamed like hot coals in the night. The villagers said he wasn't just a beast, but a demon, bound to Efua through blood rituals. If she pointed her finger at someone, Kofi would attack without mercy. The arrival of the orphan. One afternoon, as Efua sat in her courtyard, sipping palm wine from a golden cup, she heard a knock on the iron gates. Her brother-in-law, Kwaku, stood outside, and beside him, a small girl no older than 10. The child had deep brown skin, hair in tight braids, and large, curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. She clutched a small cloth bag, the only thing she owned. Efua, Kwaku said, his voice firm, this is Abeni. She is an orphan. I have brought her here because she has no one left. I want you to take her in. Efua's eyes narrowed. And why would I do such a thing? She asked coldly. She is family, Efua, Kwaku replied. She has nowhere else to go. Efua scoffed. Family. I have no family except myself. But Kwaku was not a man to be denied. He placed a hand on Abeni's shoulder, his eyes filled with quiet determination. A child should not suffer alone, Efua. Take her in, even if only for a little while. Efua sighed, her lips tight with irritation. Finally, she snapped her fingers, signaling the gatekeeper to let them in. She may stay, Efua said, but she will not be my daughter. She will follow my rules, and if she disobeys me, she will suffer the consequences. Abeni nodded quickly, though her heart pounded in her chest. A house of shadows. Inside the mansion, Abeni was given a small room near the servants' quarters, far from the luxury of Efua's own chambers. The house was grand, filled with shimmering gold decorations, large woven tapestries, and floors so clean they shone like mirrors. But despite its beauty, the air inside felt heavy. The maids moved like ghosts, their eyes cast downward, their faces pale with fear. The guards stood still as statues, never speaking unless spoken to. And most of all, no one dared to look directly at Efua. Abeni soon learned why. Efua ruled her house like a queen of iron. Her voice, though never raised, carried the weight of thunder. If something displeased her, a single cold stare could send shivers down anyone's spine. And then there was Kofi. The hound never left Efua's side. He prowled the mansion's halls, his claws clicking against the polished floors. Whenever Abeni walked past, his amber eyes followed her, filled with something unnatural, something almost human. The warning. On her first night in the mansion, Efua called Abeni to her chamber. The room was larger than any house Abeni had ever seen. A massive wooden chest sat in the corner, covered with old cloth. The air smelled of incense and something else, something bitter, like burnt herbs. Efua sat on a high-back chair, her long fingers tapping against the armrest. Listen to me, girl, she said softly. You will speak only when spoken to. You will not touch anything in this house unless I tell you to. And most importantly, she pointed to the old wooden chest in the corner. You will never, under any circumstances, open that chest. If you do, you will regret the day you entered my home. Abeni nodded quickly, her breath shallow. She wanted to ask why, but she knew better. As she turned to leave, she felt Efua's gaze burning into her back. "Do not forget, child," Efua said. "This is my house. My rules. Disobedience will not be forgiven." Abeni's silent fear. That night, Abeni lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She had been in the house for only a day, but already she felt like a bird trapped in a golden cage. She wondered about the chest in Efua's room. What was inside it? Why was Efua so protective of it? As she drifted off to sleep, she thought she heard something, a faint whispering from far away, like voices carried by the wind. The forbidden chamber and the secrets of the past. The days in Madam Efua's mansion passed like a slow-moving river, silent and heavy. Abeni kept to herself, obeying every command without question. She never raised her voice, never asked for more than she was given, and never stepped beyond where she was allowed. But no matter how quiet she was, Kofi never stopped watching her. The great black hound followed her silently, his yellow eyes always locked onto her movements. The mates avoided him, whispering among themselves that Kofi was not a normal beast. "That dog is not just a dog," one of the older mates told Abeni in hushed tones. "He is her shadow. Her protector. He sees everything, and he knows things no creature should know." Abeni shivered. She had always loved animals, but Kofi was different. There was something unnatural about him, something that made her skin prickle whenever she caught his golden gaze. The whispering chest. One afternoon, while dusting the grand hall, Abeni heard it again, the whispering. At first, she thought it was the wind. But as she stood still, holding her breath, she realized the sound was coming from Madam Efua's chamber. The door was closed, but the whispers slipped through the cracks like smoke. Her heart pounded. She glanced around. The house was silent, the maids busy elsewhere. Efua was in town for the afternoon, and Kofi was nowhere in sight. She had always been one never to enter that room. But the whispers called to her. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, heavy with the scent of incense and something else, something sharp, like burnt metal. The wooden chest sat in the corner, covered in old cloth. And it was whispering. The whispers weren't words, not exactly. They were echoes, voices carried from far away, as if the past itself was trying to speak to her. Abeni swallowed hard. She knew she shouldn't, but her hands moved on their own. She reached for the chest. Her fingers trembled as she pulled back the cloth, revealing ancient carvings burned into the wood. The symbols were unfamiliar, but they made her skin crawl. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside, she found rags covered in dried blood, strange bones wrapped in twine, and a charm that pulsed with unnatural energy. Her breath caught. But then, she saw it. Beneath the bones and bloodied cloth, tucked away in the corner, was a small, faded piece of fabric. A baby's cloth. Abeni froze. She reached down, pulling the cloth closer. It was old, but something about it felt familiar. That was when the whispers grew louder. The room darkened, shadows creeping toward her like living things. And then... "What are you doing?" Efua's wrath. The door slammed open with a force that made the walls tremble. Efua stood in the doorway, her eyes burning with rage. Abeni jumped back, dropping the cloth as her hands flew to her chest. I was just... Slap. Efua's hand struck her face so hard she fell to the ground. Her breath caught in her throat. Her cheek burned. "How dare you disobey me?" Efua's voice was like a hiss, low and venomous. "Did I not tell you never to touch that chest?" Abeni scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. I heard something." The chest was whispering. "I didn't mean." Efua's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Abeni saw fear flicker in them. "You heard it," Efua whispered, stepping closer. Abeni nodded slowly. For a long moment, Efua said nothing. Then, her face twisted with fury. You will pay for this. She turned sharply and snapped her fingers. A low growl rumbled from the doorway. Abeni's blood turned to ice. Kofi. The beast stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the exit. His eyes glowed like embers, his ears pinned back, his fangs bared in a silent snarl. Efua's voice was calm, too calm. Run! Abeni's breath hitched. She didn't move. Efua's gaze hardened. Run! Abeni turned and bolted. Kofi lunged. They chased through the night. Abeni's bare feet slapped against the cold floors as she ran. The hallway bled around her. Behind her, Kofi's claws tore into the ground, his snarls echoing like a demon's growl. She darted around the corner, nearly slipping, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She could hear him closing in. She ran for the front door, but the moment she reached for it, she heard Efua murmur something behind her. The door slammed shut on its own. Magic. She was trapped. Abeni's eyes darted wildly, she needed another way out. She ran toward the servants' entrance, but before she could reach it, Kofi lunged. His massive weight slammed into her, sending her crashing onto the marble floor. His claws raked her shoulder, leaving deep gashes. She screamed. Pain exploded through her arm, but she kicked wildly, scrambling to break free. The dog snarled, his breath hot against her face. Enough, Efua's voice called. Immediately, Kofi backed away, but his eyes never left her. Abeni shook, her breath ragged. Her arm throbbed, blood seeping into her clothes. Efua stepped forward, her face stone cold. This is my last warning, child. She loomed over Abeni, her shadow stretching like a specter. You will never disobey me again. If you do. She looked at Kofi. The message was clear. Abeni clenched her fist. She would not cry. She would not beg. But deep inside, something in her shifted. She had always feared Efua. Always obeyed. But now, as she stared up at the woman who ruled with cruelty, she felt something else. Something she had never dared to feel before. Hatred. And somewhere in the darkness, Kofi's glowing eyes watched her. Haunted by the beast. The air in Madam Efua's mansion grew heavier after that night. The servants avoided Abeni, their eyes filled with silent warnings. Nobody spoke of what had happened. Nobody mentioned the whispering chest or the blood-stained cloth Abeni had found. And nobody asked about the wounds on Abeni's shoulder. Efua went about her days as if nothing had changed, but Abeni could feel her watchful eyes on her at all times. And worst of all, Kofi never left her side. A restless night. Abeni lay awake in her small room, her bandaged shoulder throbbing. The candle by her bedside flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. She tried to push away the fear, but sleep would not come. Somewhere deep in the mansion, she heard Efua speaking. At first, it was just murmurs. But then, a name. Her name. Abeni's heart stopped. She sat up slowly, straining to listen. Efua's voice was low, speaking in a language Abeni did not recognize. But she caught a few words. The child must be erased, she knows too much. Abeni's breath hitched. Erased. A cold dread spread through her stomach. She had to get out of this house. Now. The escape. Abeni waited until the deepest part of the night, when the mansion was silent. She crept to her door, pressing her ear against it. No sound. Slowly, she pushed it open. The hallway stretched empty and dark. She moved carefully, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. Step by step, she made her way toward the servants' entrance. Her heart pounded so loudly she was afraid it would wake the entire house. She reached the door. Her fingers wrapped around the handle. She held her breath. Then, a growl. Abeni froze. Kofi. She turned her head slowly. The dog stood at the end of the hallway, his yellow eyes glowing like embers. A low, deep snarl rumbled in his throat. Abeni's blood ran cold. He was waiting for her. She gripped the door handle tightly, but before she could pull it open, she heard Efua's voice. Sharp. Commanding. Kofi, finish it. The hound lunged forward. The hunt begins. Abeni ripped the door open and bolted. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop. Behind her, Kofi charged after her, his heavy paws thundering against the ground. Abeni ran as fast as she could, her breath coming in gasps, her lungs burning. The village was too far. The only place she could go. The forest. She veered sharply, heading toward the dense trees. The branches whipped against her skin as she forced her way through the undergrowth. Kofi snapped at her heels, his growls growing louder. Abeni tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. She rolled onto her back, scrambling away just as Kofi lunged for her throat. She grabbed a rock, swinging it with all her strength. It struck his muzzle. The beast yelped, shaking his head, but it wasn't enough. Kofi recovered instantly, his lips peeling back in a snarl. Abeni knew she wouldn't be fast enough this time. Her back hit the base of a large tree. Nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. Kofi crouched low, preparing to pounce. And then, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Kofi froze. His ears flicked. And out of the darkness, a figure emerged. The old man in the forest. Abeni's vision blurred from exhaustion, but she could make out an old man, tall and wiry, wearing a robe of woven vines and beads. He held a wooden staff, carved with symbols Abeni didn't recognize. His face was weathered, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a power beyond this world. Kofi, the man said, his voice commanding. The dog whimpered. Go back, the man said. Kofi snarled, but the old man did not flinch. He slammed his staff into the ground. A deep, echoing vibration rippled through the air. Kofi let out a sharp yelp, then turned and fled, disappearing into the trees. Abeni collapsed, her body trembling. The old man knelt beside her. Do not fear, child, he said gently. You are safe now. Abeni's vision darkened. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was the old man watching her with knowing eyes. The hidden truth. Abeni awoke to the soft crackling of a fire and the scent of burning herbs. She blinked, her vision adjusting to the dim glow of a small hut, its walls made of woven reeds and its roof thick with dried palm leaves. The old man who had saved her sat across the fire, grinding something in a small clay bowl. His eyes flicked up. Good, he murmured. You are awake. Abeni tried to sit up, but pain shot through her shoulder where Kofi's claws had raked her skin. She winced. Drink this, the man said, handing her a small wooden cup filled with dark liquid. Abeni hesitated. The man gave a knowing smile. If I wanted you dead, child, I would not have sent Kofi away. Abeni swallowed hard, then lifted the cup to her lips. The liquid was bitter, but as it flowed down her throat, warmth spread through her body, dulling the pain. The old man watched her closely. You have seen something, haven't you? He asked. Abeni stiffened. She thought of the whispering chest, the blood-stained cloth, the strange carvings on the wood. She nodded slowly. The man sighed. Then the ancestors have brought you to me at the right time, he said. There are things you must know. And things you must remember. Abeni frowned. Remember, she echoed. The man's gaze grew piercing. Yes, child, he said. Because the truth is not just something you will learn. It is something you have always known. Efua's curse. The old man threw a handful of powdered leaves into the fire. Immediately, the flames flared high, changing from orange to deep blue. The shadows on the walls began to shift and dance, forming images, visions of the past. Abeni held her breath. She saw Madam Efua, but younger, her face softer, her eyes filled with something close to love. She was holding a baby. Abeni's heart stopped. The child had dark brown skin, tiny braids in her hair. The baby looked like her. Abeni turned to the old man, shaking her head. No, she whispered. The old man's expression did not change. Many years ago, he said, Madam Efua gave birth to a daughter. A beautiful girl. Abeni's body went cold. The images in the fire changed. She saw Efua sitting in a dark room, surrounded by strange symbols. Her eyes were hollow, her face streaked with dried tears. She was told her baby was stillborn, the old man continued. That the child had died before she could even hold her. Abeni's hands clenched into fists. But she did not accept it. She turned to the dark ways, calling upon spirits that should never be disturbed. She begged them to return the child to her. The fire crackled, and in the vision, Efua spoke to an unseen force. But the spirits were cruel. She asked for the baby's return, the old man said, his voice heavy. But instead, she was cursed. The flames flickered violently. Her soul was bound to the beast Kofi. She would never bear another child, never feel love again. The ancestors decreed that even if her daughter lived, she would never recognize her. Abeni's throat tightened. The vision shifted once more. She saw a young girl, wrapped in rags, being carried away by an old woman. She saw herself. Abeni gasped. No, she whispered. She turned to the old man, her voice shaking. You're saying that Efua is? Yes, child, he said gently. She is your mother. The mother's betrayal. Abeni felt sick. The woman who had hated her, hurt her, nearly let Kofi kill her, was her own blood. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to cry. She never even looked at me, Abeni whispered. She didn't know. The old man shook his head. The spirits took that knowledge from her. The moment she saw you, her heart would turn to stone. Abeni's mind raced. So that's why Efua never felt warmth toward her. That's why she was so quick to cast her aside. She had wanted a daughter for years, and when the ancestors gave her one, she had driven her away. Abeni's hands clenched. What do I do? She whispered. The old man studied her. You have two choices, he said. One, you can leave this place forever. Forget Madam Efua, forget the curse, and live your life far from here. Abeni's breath hitched. And the second. The old man's gaze was unreadable. You return, he said, and you break the curse. Abeni stared at him. Break it, she repeated. How? The old man leaned forward. You must make Efua remember. Abeni's stomach twisted. How do I do that? The old man's eyes gleamed. You must return to the mansion, he said, and open the chest. Abeni's blood turned to ice. She remembered Efua's words. If you ever touch that chest, you will regret it. The old man saw her fear. That chest holds her past, he said. The cloth you found, it belonged to you. When Efua sees it, she will remember. Abeni hesitated. Could she do it? Could she return to that house, to the woman who had nearly let her die? She didn't know. But deep inside, something in her stirred. A feeling stronger than fear. Stronger than hatred. Determination. She lifted her chin. I'll do it. The old man smiled. The ancestors are watching, child, he said. Be ready. Abeni took a deep breath. Tomorrow night, she would return to the house of shadows. And she would make her mother see the truth. A mother's curse comes full circle. The following night, Abeni stood at the edge of the village, staring at the looming gates of Madam Efua's mansion. The house looked the same, cold, lifeless, and silent. But tonight, something was different. The air felt thicker, charged with an unseen force. The shadows along the walls seemed to move on their own. The wind carried whispers that only she could hear. The spirits were watching. She tightened her grip on the blood-stained baby cloth tucked inside her pocket. It was time. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. Crossing the threshold. The guards at the mansion's entrance barely glanced at her. They had seen Abeni before. A child cast out was no threat. But this time, she walked with purpose. This time, she was not afraid. She slipped inside the grand hall, her footsteps silent. The house was eerily still. She knew where she had to go. Efua's chamber. She moved swiftly, taking the familiar path toward the forbidden room. But as she reached the corridor, a low, deep snarl stopped her in her tracks. Her heart dropped. Kofi. The great black beast stood in the hallway, his golden eyes glowing in the dim light. His lips curled back, revealing gleaming fangs. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, he lunged. The final confrontation. Abeni dove aside, rolling across the cold marble floor as Kofi's massive form crashed where she had stood. She scrambled to her feet, panting. Kofi spun around, growling low and deadly. Abeni's hands tightened into fists. She knew this time, she couldn't run. This time, she had to face him. Taking a deep breath, she stood her ground. She stared straight into his glowing eyes. And she whispered, I am not afraid of you. Kofi snarled. But for the first time, he hesitated. Abeni took a step forward. You are not a beast, she said, her voice steady. You are part of her. The part that is broken. The part that is afraid. Kofi's snarl weakened. His ears flicked. Abeni took another step. I see you, she whispered. I see what she did to you. Kofi whimpered. His glowing eyes flickered. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Abeni reached into her pocket and pulled out the baby cloth. This is my past, she said softly. And it is hers, too. Kofi lowered his head, sniffing the cloth. And then, he stepped aside. Abeni's breath hitched. She had won. Without another word, she walked past him and opened the door to Efua's chamber. The breaking of the curse. Madam Efua was inside, sitting at her grand vanity, staring into the mirror. She did not turn as Abeni entered. I knew you would return, she said, her voice low. Abeni swallowed hard. You have to see the truth, she said. Efua's reflection smirked. What truth, child? Abeni stepped forward, holding up the cloth. The truth of who I am. Efua's expression changed. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the cloth. For a moment, she simply stared. Then, her breath hitched. Her hands shook. And then, her eyes widened in horror. The room darkened. The spirits of the past rushed in, their whispers filling the air. The curse unraveled. And Efua remembered. She staggered back, clutching her chest. No, she gasped. No, it cannot be. Abeni's eyes filled with tears. I am your daughter, she whispered. The child you lost. The child you cast aside. Efua fell to her knees. She sobbed. The spirit's whispers rose into a wail. And in that moment, Efua's curse shattered. Her soul was freed. Her heart opened. And she saw Abeni for who she truly was. Tears streamed down her face. She reached out a trembling hand. "My child," she whispered. But Abeni stepped back. Efua had hurt her too much. Some wounds could never heal. She turned away, leaving Efua kneeling in the darkness. As Abeni walked out of the mansion for the last time, she felt something shift in the air. The shadows had lifted. The house of curses was no more. And at last, she was free. The wrath of the ancestors. The night air felt different as Abeni stepped out of the mansion. Lighter. Freer. The weight she had carried for years, the fear, the pain, the unanswered questions, was gone. But inside, Madam Efua was not free. She was still on her knees, trembling. For the first time in her life, she was truly afraid. Because she could feel it. The ancestors were watching. Their whispers grew louder, surrounding her like a storm. They had waited for this moment. And now, they would judge her. The judgment of the spirits. Efua's body seized as an invisible force wrapped around her. The fire in her room dimmed, its glow flickering unnaturally. And then, the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. One by one, they stretched, twisting into figures of the past. The spirits had come. Efua's breath itched as she recognized their faces. Her mother. Her father. Her ancestors. They stood before her, their hollow eyes filled with disappointment. "You have brought disgrace to our bloodline, Efua." The voice was deep and unyielding. It did not come from one spirit, but all of them. Efua shook her head, tears rolling down her face. "I did not know," she gasped. "I did not recognize her. Lies." The spirits' voices shook the walls. "You had chances," they said. "You could have chosen kindness. You could have chosen love. But you chose cruelty." Efua's hands shook. She tried to speak, but the spirit's whispers grew louder, drowning her out. "Your greed. Your selfishness. Your cruelty. You called upon dark forces to return what was never lost. And for that, you have paid the price." The air around her grew colder. Efua gasped, clutching at her chest as a deep, painful force wrapped around her soul. And then, she screamed. The fall of a queen. The mansion shuddered, as if the spirits themselves were tearing it apart. Outside, Abeni turned, hearing the cries of her mother. But she did not go back. She couldn't. She had done what she came to do. And now, the ancestors would decide Efua's fate. The villagers awoke as thunder rumbled across the sky, though there was no storm. They rushed to the mansion, watching in shock as the grand estate, the house that had stood for generations, began to crumble. It was not fire. Not wind. But something older. Something final. A force greater than any human power. And at the center of it all was Madam Efua. She stood in the courtyard, her body trembling as the spirit's judgment sealed her fate. Her wealth. Her power. Her legacy. Everything was being stripped away. The mansion's golden gates rusted before the villagers' eyes. The walls, once proud and strong, cracked and crumbled into dust. The riches she had hoarded vanished, swallowed by the earth itself. And Efua, once the most feared woman in the village, fell to the ground, her body frail and broken. The cursed queen had lost her throne. She reached out, her lips trembling, whispering the name she had refused to speak for so long. Abeni. But her daughter was already gone. A new beginning. The next morning, the sun rose over Kumosi, shining on a changed village. The grand mansion, once the symbol of fear and power, was nothing but ruins. The villagers spoke in whispers, saying the spirits had taken what was owed. And Efua? She wandered the streets, barefoot and hollow-eyed. The woman who had once ruled with an iron grip was now a beggar, her once beautiful robes torn and ragged. People recognized her. But no one helped her. She had spent her life closing her heart to others. And now, the world had closed its heart to her. Abeni's choice. Far from the village, Abeni stood at the edge of the forest, watching the morning sun. She felt lighter. For the first time in her life, she was truly free. But she also felt something else. Sadness. Because no matter what had happened, Efua had still been her mother. The woman who had nearly destroyed her had also given her life. The old man's voice echoed in her mind. You have two choices. You can live forever or you can break the curse. Abeni thought she had already broken it. But as she turned back toward the village, she realized there was one last thing left to do. And so, with the strength of the ancestors behind her, Abeni took her first step toward forgiveness, justice and redemption. The morning air was crisp as Abeni walked through the village. The people of Kumosi watched her with quiet respect. They had all heard what had happened. How the ancestors had delivered judgment. How Madam Efua, once wealthy and feared, had been stripped of everything. Now, she wandered the streets, a shadow of her former self, a lesson of what happens to those who choose cruelty over love. Abeni should have felt satisfied. But she didn't. Because despite everything, her heart still ached. A mother's regret. She found Efua sitting by a dry well, her head bowed, her fingers clutching her tattered shawl. The woman who had once ruled a house of gold now sat in the dust. Abeni stood before her. Efua didn't look up. I knew you would come, she murmured. Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't filled with command or pride. It was tired. I don't know why, Efua whispered, but I dreamed of you last night. In my dream, you were still a child, reaching out for me. And I? Her breath caught. Tears filled her eyes. And I turned away, she finished in a whisper. Abeni said nothing. She simply watched. Efua finally looked at her. And for the first time, there was no hatred in her eyes. Only pain. I was blind, Abeni, Efua murmured. The curse stole my memory, but it did not steal my choices. I chose to be cruel. I chose to push you away. She let out a broken laugh. And now, the ancestors have taken everything from me. Rightly so. Abeni clenched her fist. Do you think I wanted this? She asked, her voice shaking. Efua flinched. I did not seek revenge, Abeni continued. I only wanted to know the truth. Her voice softened. I only wanted a mother. A tear slipped down Efua's cheek. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, Efua lowered her head. I have nothing left, she murmured. Not even the right to ask for forgiveness. Abeni took a deep breath. She thought of the pain she had suffered. The fear. The loneliness. And she thought of what her father would have wanted. What the ancestors would have wanted. She kneeled before her mother. You have lost your home, she said softly. But you have not lost me. Efua's eyes widened in shock. Abeni reached out and took her mother's trembling hand. If you truly seek redemption, she said, then come with me. A new life. The village was silent as Abeni led her mother through the streets. People whispered. Some stared in disbelief. But no one stopped them. Abeni brought Efua to the healer's hut, where the old man who had saved her waited. He took one look at Efua's worn face and nodded. She is ready to repent, Abeni said simply. The old man smiled. Then let her begin. Years later. Time passed. And in that time, Madam Efua changed. The woman who had once ruled with fear and cruelty became a servant of the village. She worked alongside the people she had once scorned. She mended roofs, carried water, and helped the sick. At first, the villagers doubted her. But over time, they saw that her heart had truly changed. And Abeni. She did not return to the mansion, for it was no longer hers to claim. Instead, she built a new home, a small, simple house near the village square. And in that house, Efua lived with her. Not as a mistress. Not as a ruler. But as a mother. A mother who had once lost everything, and had been given a second chance. A mother who, at last, chose love over fear. The final lesson. One evening, as the sun set over Kumosi, Abeni sat beside her mother outside their small home. Efua looked at her with quiet wonder. "You are stronger than I ever was," she murmured. Abeni smiled softly. "No," she said. "I just chose a different path." Efua nodded. The choice had always been there. And in the end, it had made all the difference.